All right, welcome to yet another edition of this mini lecture series. The topic this time is actually going to come from a question I received on Instagram, and this is actually a topic that's come up several times that hopefully it can maybe lend a little bit of insight on from a purely academic standpoint, since clearly I have no personal experience with this. So please bear with me as I dive into this topic. So the question was, should women train around their menstrual cycle? Now, this is something that is, I would say, I don't even want to say controversial. It's something that I think a lot of people are scared to touch. As we know, a lot of sports science research is done very heavily on men. Part of that is precisely because men do not have a menstrual cycle. And this makes it much easier to assume things like, consistent hormone levels and, consistent recovery and things like that throughout the course of a study. It is also, of course, ethically a lot easier to get approval for studies in men due to, of course, the absence of potential for pregnancy, and therefore, this is why we tend to see that sports science is weighted heavily again in the direction of being performed on men. So this is a question then that is, slowly, I think, being more and more addressed. You can find studies dating back to the 80s and 90s that look at the effects of different phases of the menstrual cycle on training, but the data is still relatively sparse. So in a lot of cases, we're kind of left to our own sort of practical experience and practical recommendations. So let's just dive into this. First, a brief introduction to terms. One of the things I talk about, and this will come up a couple times in this presentation, is we have three different levels of significance when we're looking at results. We're looking at hormone levels, things like that. The first tier is statistically significant. Now, statistically significant means effectively that a difference in some variable that you're tracking, whether it's hormone levels, body weight, strength, whatever, is statistically, it passes a statistical test that basically lets you say, okay, this is almost definitively not due to random chance. This is due to a significant change in whatever the underlying variable is. Of course, statistically significant doesn't necessarily mean clinically significant. A 3 to 4% increase across the board in some level of some hormone may be statistically significant, but clinically significant. In other words, in terms of creating actual results or noticeable results in the endpoint, in the greater endpoint, for example, say muscle size, there may be no significance whatsoever. So a 3% or 4% increase in testosterone levels may be statistically significant, but clinically speaking, you'll see no change in muscle size whatsoever, so therefore it's not clinically significant. Now, the even greater tier on this is whether or not something is practically significant. Something can be statistically significant. In other words, it's a variable that's not due to chance. It can be clinically significant. In other words, there's a noticeable difference in endpoints. But practically significant, it may not actually bear out. It may not actually be significant enough to recommend a change in any sort of practical behavior. That is something that is very key and that is often overlooked in a lot of sports science, I think, is how clinically significant results are then used to actually change programming. And of course, changing programming, which usually is focused around adjusting the most important variables, is suddenly altered in less favorable ways to account for these minor points of clinical significance. So if something is statistically significant, clinically significant, and practically significant, it means you should probably listen to it. Now, throughout this mini presentation, I'm going to use women and female interchangeably for simplicity. Bear in mind what I am speaking about here are biological women with full reproductive system. Now, without certain organs, as mentioned here, this process does not occur, nor do many secondary processes. I'm just reading the slide, I apologize. But for example, premenstrual syndrome, the cramping is often caused from prostaglandins that are released specifically from the endometrial lining as it's shed. That is what causes radiating cramps, that causes cramps in the midsection, that can cause GI cramping, etc., etc. If this lining is not actually produced, it is therefore not shed, and therefore these cramps do not occur via this same mechanism. So again, for simplicity's sake, we are talking about a general case here. So many of you folks may know, of course, and this is probably more for many of the male trainers who may not be familiar, there are two phases to the menstrual cycle. The follicular phase, which refers to FSH stimulation of developing follicles, which is the egg. Now, during the follicular phase, at the beginning of the cycle, estrogen levels start low and then start to increase about a week in. As these estrogen levels increase, they slowly cause the follicle to enlarge, and eventually, when estrogen levels peak, the follicle opens and the egg is released. Throughout this entire period, progesterone levels are relatively low, estrogen levels are high. Now, it's important to note here, most of the defining characteristics of these two phases have to do with these two fluctuating hormone levels. Of course, testosterone levels fluctuate, etc., but those are less significant for the purpose of this discussion. Effects of estrogen. Estrogen is not a bad hormone, in fact, for many things involving muscle growth or training in general. It often gets a bad rep, but that's because there are some almost contradictory effects of it that can be modified by the presence of or absence of other hormones. As you can see, estrogen, one of the quote-unquote downsides is that in the lower body in women especially, it can reduce body fat mobilization. It does this by essentially changing the expression of alpha-2 receptors in fat cells. Now, again, this is preferentially in the lower body, which of course explains estrogenic fat deposits. It has very little effect in fat cells and fat mobilization in the upper body, and in fact in visceral fat. As you can see, it in fact inhibits visceral fat deposition, which is a very good thing for health. Visceral fat is the really insidious, very dangerous kind. It upregulates AMP kinase, among other things, which, as we know, is an important hormone for many things, or important mechanism for many things, which include endurance adaptations. It increases leptin and lowers hunger via increased serotonin and dopamine. So it has positive effects on mood, potentially moderating effects on hunger. It also aids in muscle growth and repair. Now, for a lot of folks, this is something that is not necessarily understood very well, but estrogen is actually a very good hormone for muscle growth, muscle building, and repair. It's not necessarily great for tendon strength, though. That is one thing to bear in mind. Whether or not it actually weakens tendons, it does tend to increase joint laxity somewhat. So generally, the last few days leading up to ovulation, you may notice an actual increase in joint laxity. Individuals with hypermobility especially may notice that this is a factor. Now, of course, at the end of the follicular phase, usually 14 days in, of course, this is highly variable, you get ovulation, and then the luteal phase begins. Now, the luteal phase is named for the corpus luteum. That is a structure formed after the egg is released. It's still in the ovary itself. Once the egg is gone, the corpus luteum actually becomes a separate structure in the ovary that begins to secrete certain hormones that are kind of responsible for continuing to ensure the health of the egg and the creation of the lining and everything else. Basically, what you need to know, well, you don't need to know this. It does contain things like lutein, which is where the name comes from, has a yellow color. Now, what happens over time, of course, is eventually a different corpus luteum is created every single time that there's ovulation. One is created per egg usually, and at the end of a cycle, now of course this is generalization, at the end of a cycle this structure basically more or less vanishes and is absent for the next 14 days until the next egg is released and then a new one is formed. Now, lining is shed as hormone levels drop near the end of the luteal phase. Remember, the progesterone and estrogen actually somewhat increase. Progesterone becomes kind of the primary hormone during this phase. And with about 3 to 5 days left, well, actually about 6 days left, these levels peak, and then they begin to drop precipitously all the way until the end of the cycle. Progesterone itself. We don't like progesterone. First off, and what's very interesting, is it actually competes with two different receptors, the androgen receptor and the aldosterone receptor. Competing with the androgen receptor would of course be very bad for things like muscle growth because it'll bind to and more or less inactivate receptors that otherwise androgen would want to bind to for muscle growth. Now, it increases metabolic rate and temperature. This may sound like a good thing, in fact. It can increase your basal metabolic rate by about 5% or so, but unfortunately, the drop in other hormones and drop in serotonin, dopamine, etc. lead to an increase in craving. So in most people, that slight increase in metabolic rate is more or less outweighed by a massive increase in appetite, decreased satiation from food, especially because you become more leptin resistant. Sounds like a good thing for, weight control, but it's actually not. Another issue it causes is less stable blood sugar. It tends to cause a little bit of insulin resistance, which can also be a problem for energy levels. Now, Aldosterone, since it is actually often outcompeted by progesterone, actually may be less effective during the beginning part of the luteal phase, which can actually reduce water retention significantly. You may find that you look like you dry out pretty well the first part of the luteal phase, but of course, as these progesterone levels start to drop, remember when you have something competitively inhibiting a receptor, just because you have all these progesterone molecules parked on these receptors, on these aldosterone receptors, doesn't mean your body is just like, oh, well, we'll just leave everything as it is. It may actually upregulate its production of aldosterone, which means as the progesterone disappears, you can get a rebound effect, which can actually cause fairly significant water retention near the end of this phase. So progesterone basically sucks. Sucks for the purpose of this discussion, obviously. Important hormone, but more or less kind of goes against everything that you really want to be getting out of training. Now, knowing that, what's actually relevant here? So the follicular phase, the first half of the cycle, is generally associated with better mood, blood sugar levels, faster recovery, better muscle building. Luteal phase, increased hunger, decreased mood, slower recovery, obviously premenstrual syndrome symptoms, increased core temperature. Here is where the issue starts to get a little bit messier. So is the luteal phase a write-off? There are studies and there's a lot of initial preliminary work that's done showing that periodizing training with the menstrual cycle may actually return superior results. But the question becomes, like anything else, how much periodization and what kind of periodization? There's one famous study from 1995, I think, which obviously is quite a while ago. Saying 1995 is a while ago makes me feel really old, by the way. I remember 1995 very well. Yes. So anyway, this study shows that basically doing 3 sets of 12 leg extensions 3 times a week during the follicular phase and then reducing it to once a week during the luteal phase actually had better results than kind of maintaining a frequency of every 4 times a day throughout, or something similar like that. So it was a leg extension or single-legged leg press. Anyway, there's some evidence that therefore increasing volume and intensity somewhat during the follicular phase and decreasing it during the luteal phase has better overall results. Also, increasing core temperature is often brought up as in terms of giving issues with thermoregulation. Plus poor blood sugar control would be negatives for endurance athletes. So, should women just train less and less intensely during the luteal phase? It seems like a waste. Because if you think about it, have a look at the 4th item down there. 2 weeks is enough time to begin losing maximal strength output, speed, VO2 max, etc. Just because conditions are suboptimal for muscle growth and maximum strength output doesn't mean you need to put any sort of sport objectives on hold. In fact, quite far from it. What I tend to recommend here is a biphasic approach. So you have monthly mesocycles with only minor changes. You can essentially keep the same framework, but during the follicular phase, you focus more on strength or hypertrophy, and during the luteal phase, you can focus more on skill and repetition. So the thing here is, if you avoid any hypertrophy work whatsoever when you are in a state less favorable to muscle growth, you will simply compound the effect of the loss. It's like saying, oh, well, I'm dieting, or, well, I'm sick, or I'm injured, so I'm going to stop lifting entirely and hope this all goes away. No, the fact that your body is less likely to build muscle also means it's going to have a harder time retaining it, so you still need to maintain some level of activity and intensity. So during the first half of the cycle, I recommend you focus on intensity, lower repetition ranges, higher weight, focus on your heavy lifting. When you do your hypertrophy work, focus on higher intensity / fewer reps in reserve. In other words, approaching closer to failure. I usually never recommend to failure. When it comes to your endurance side of things, this is the time to do your speed work, your interval work. There is a marginal ability to handle or acclimate to heat better. Bear in mind the increase in temperature is only 1 to 2 degrees at most in the body. A lot of people like to throw this out there as saying, here's this big revelation. Your core temperature goes up during the first few days after ovulation, therefore you shouldn't train in the heat. A runner can actually get core body temperatures up to 104 plus degrees, and thermoregulation, of course, is a lot more than basal metabolic rate and your resting core temperature. There are a lot of factors that go into this. It's just something worth noting. If you're going to be pushing the ragged edges of your, of your heat training and heat performance, it's just kind of worth keeping in the back of your mind. Now, if you are in a weight loss phase, cravings are going to be easier to manage during this period of time. So during the follicular phase, train, progress as normal. Go heavy, go hard, push it, do everything you're going to do. Now, during the luteal phase, what I recommend is a slight switch, not a complete switch. Think of it more as a shift to a skill and repetition focus. So lower the weight slightly, focus on dynamic effort, speed, and form. Preserve your hypertrophy work, but more reps in reserve. Most of us in our training can probably benefit by spending a little more time actually focusing on fundamentals. Breaking down movements, breaking down portions of movements, focusing on things like bar speed, focusing on things like, let's use this as an opportunity to potentially correct errors in movement and things like that. We don't do enough of this anyway. This is a fantastic way to basically make either you or your athletes shift through these phases and still be able to progress. Now, bear in mind, there is absolutely no impact to motor learning skills, skill acquisition, or anything else based on any of these hormonal changes. So you're not going to notice that as a factor. Again, maybe some slight issues with thermoregulation. So if you are in an extreme heat wave or something similar, maybe don't plan on PRing your distance. Potentially consider reducing your working maxes, or if you or yourself work with athletes, especially individuals who seem to be affected particularly significantly by their monthly cycle, consider having working maxes both for the beginning of their cycle and midway through. That may give you a slightly better idea of maximal strength output, and simply adjust those percentages accordingly. It may only be 1 to 2%, but 1 to 2% can make a difference. If that's not something you feel like doing, don't worry about it, just a thought. Now, another important thing to keep in mind, cramping, of course, potentially cramping in the last 3 to 5 days of the cycle during when a lot of PMS symptoms arrive, may cause significant postural changes during running, and GI upset can reduce the effectiveness and intra-workout fueling. In other words, you are going to be less able to process and absorb fluids. You're going to get poorer sodium return in the lower intestine, etc. And of course, again, don't underestimate that even slight cramping can cause more forward torso leaning, a little bit more guarding in posture, which can affect a lot of things like pelvic tilt. It can affect how you're outputting strength. It can affect running form. So these are all things to keep in mind. If you are experiencing particularly bad cramping, this may be a time period to potentially reduce, eliminate, or switch your running or endurance work to pure skill or form work. In other words, you could do things like banded running, running in place. You can potentially cross-train to things that allow you to maintain a more comfortable position. But if you're particularly affected, consider eliminating or removing this. The reason I say that is because even a single long run in a poor postural position can lead to things like pulled hamstrings, tight Achilles, back issues, neck issues, and a lot of things. So consider that. Now, also, cravings, more challenging to manage. If you are in a weight loss phase, in a dieting phase, consider potentially taking diet breaks, again, like it says here, for 3 to 5 days during the 3rd week of the cycle. Reason for that is I think most people can benefit from kind of a stepwise weight loss program regardless. It always makes sense during any sort of extended cut to have periods of time where you sort of stabilize the calories and everything else. That can be done anytime during the luteal phase, but the one reason I would say do it potentially during the first part of the luteal phase is during the second part of the luteal phase, you may notice a lot of water retention anyway. From kind of that rebound water retention as progesterone levels drop. What that may mean, even just psychologically, is you may see an alarming increase in scale weight. If you or your athlete is perfectly aware of that and prepared to deal with it, great. I just find sometimes psychologically it's a little bit easier to say, hey, I'm not going to lose weight this week, because I'm on a diet break, and potentially then the next week they'll get some of that water retention, but they'll also be back in weight loss phase. What they'll see is 2 weeks where it's stable and then a sudden drop leading into the beginning of the follicular phase. So bear in mind athlete psychology when you get to that point. So the only thing is, overall, consider this phase consolidation of fundamental metrics, focus on improvements in technique, skill, aerobic base, focus less on kind of the ragged edges of performance. Most importantly, if you have a coach, communicate and advocate. Like it says, these do not have, you don't have to adjust your program because of this. It's just these may, if you're affected particularly hard, or even if you just want to bear in mind why, looking at trends, why certain things may seem to come in cycles according to this is actually what's going on. This is absolutely worth tracking with your coach. And even if your coach is male and has no direct experience with this, a good coach knows how to track variables. A good coach knows how to look at every potential consideration, and whether this is there are so many factors that affect athlete readiness. You've got all these other things. You've got sleep, you've got stress, you've got nutritional status, you've got sickness, you've got so many other things. This is just one more variable that you really should always be at least somewhat proactive in informing your coach about. Even if they're dead set against adjusting your program and you're dead set against adjusting your program, knowing that this is going to modify your outputs can help you set more realistic expectations for various phases. So that's really all there is to it. I say that's all there is to it. There is a lot to this. This is obviously a very, very complicated process, but hopefully if you're just starting to delve into this area and interested in a few kind of hopefully interesting takeaways, this should cover it. Now, bear in mind, this equation changes entirely because of birth control. If you're interested in that topic, let us know. We're going to be unrolling an entire program, an entire solution, an entire group focused exclusively on women's training and women's issues, and hopefully this will give people a much more in-depth understanding, in-depth knowledge of how to best optimize training for women. So, thank you very much. Hope this was interesting. The end.